There is perhaps no other entity in horror literature that has been so deeply enshrined in the rich flowing tapestry of a culture and a people than that of the Wendigo. You see, whether its depiction differs from source to source, be it in early 17th century literature or more recently in television, graphic literature and visual media, the exact transformation of this deeply complex and important creature can be traced through time like the rings of an ancient redwood. The thing is though, as this lore has more recently established itself firmly in horror fiction as a whole, the legend of the Wendigo is as ancient and ever-changing still. But to understand it, we first have to peel back the layers of history in an attempt to search for its roots. So, let's see what we can dig up. Hello horror fans, what's going on? And once again, welcome back to the scariest channel on YouTube, Top 5 Scary Videos. As per usual, I'll be your horror host, Jack Finches. Today, we return to the lore explored and take a look at the Wendigo. Roll the clip.
What was that? It's just a loon.
Sorry there pal, but it is not a loon. For the curious amongst you, that clip was from 2019's Pet Sematary, based upon Stephen King's 1983 novel of the same name, which, for those of you that have read it, will know that it's one of King's most despairing of tales, and also that movie got quite a bit of stick, but hey, I thought it was pretty good. Also, interestingly enough, King's adaptation decided to flesh out the age-old tale of the ancient burial ground of legend by pairing it with the spirit of the Wendigo, which is telling to modern fiction's interpretation of the Wendigo myth, but as we're about to find out, there is far more to it than an antler-bound revenant of the dead. To first understand a creature or a concept, perhaps our first port of call should be the etymology behind it. The definition of the term Wendigo is a key part of the oral traditions of the indigenous people of North America, and well, that's where we first find our first problem, because as we will quickly find, there are many different ways to portray the word Wendigo. In the Ojibwe language, it is the Windigo. In the language of the Algonquin people, it is Wajigo. In the Cree, it is the Wikitau. And in the Proto-Algonquin of the Algic, it is Wi Nekito Wa, which most likely translated to owl in their original language. And this is where it is difficult to pinpoint the exact origin of the concept, or whether there even was an origin point, and the Wendigo instead emerged into the psyche of the indigenous people of North America through a shared sense of moral obligation, or even stranger still, the same shared experiences. That though is pure speculation, but interestingly enough, there is a similar word, the Wachuge, that depicts a similar being that appears in the legends of the Athabascan people of the Northwest Pacific coast. You see, much like the Wendigo, the Wachuge is a man-eating creature that devours flesh as a curse and eternal punishment. But interestingly, the Wachuge of legend is instead inexplicably tied to the creation mythos of a specific group of Athabascan people, the Danija, which roughly translate to those who live among the beaver, who believe that in their mythology the Wachuge was a person who would become possessed or overwhelmed by the power of one of the ancient giant spirit animals that form the basis of their oral tradition. In most instances, the Wachuge is depicted as a creature formed of ice and can only be killed by being thrown into a campfire and kept there overnight until it has melted. In some instances, however, this creature is even depicted as having wings, a rare occurrence in the traditions of North American legend and a symbol of great importance. Whichever depiction of the Wendigo myth we take though, one thing is for certain. In the traditional belief systems of the Ojibwe, the Saulteaux, the Cree, the Naskapi, the Innu, and many other Algonquin-speaking peoples of North America, the Wendigo is far more than just a cautionary tale told to children over a campfire. It is an integral part of their complex belief system, and in most cases it served as a taboo reinforcement, both a reminder and a warning of the hardships faced through winter. No matter which depiction of the myth we pull apart, in each of them, the Wendigo is seen as the embodiment of gluttony and greed, particularly in relation to the unbreakable taboo of cannibalism. It is a cultural cornerstone, a warning sign of excess in consumption, and the creature that would later form these warning signs would become the embodiment of that. Now, that is not to say that the depiction of the Wendigo was always the same. In some cases, particularly in regard to Ojibwe and Cree lore, the Wendigo was often described as a giant creature, many times larger than a human being, a differing characteristic that was absent from other Wendigo myths of Algonquin culture. In these legends, whenever a Wendigo would consume another person, it would grow larger in proportion to the meal it had just eaten, preventing it from ever sating its own hunger. It always wanted more, never sated or content with its quarry. That's an important lesson for all of us to learn, I think. But still, this led to the garish and oftentimes terrifying description of this creature that would later become the driving force behind its evolution from the 20th century onwards, particularly when we analyse its depiction in modern horror fiction. As Basil H. Johnson, an Ojibwe teacher and scholar from Ontario, described in his 1995 book The Manitous, the Spirit World of the Ojibwe, the Wendigo was gaunt to the point of emaciation, its desiccated skin pulled tightly over its bones. With its bones pushing out against its skin, its complexion the ash grey of death, and its eyes pushed back deep into their sockets, the Wendigo looked like a gaunt skeleton recently disinterred from the grave. What lips it had were tattered and bloody, unclean and suffering from suppuration of the flesh. The Wendigo gave off a strange and eerie odour of decay and decomposition, of death and corruption. And this is where the modern depiction of the Wendigo gained traction as an entity of horror fiction. The Wendigo is terrifying, a humanoid supernatural creature that exemplified an eternal hunger, and as European settlers made their way through North America and the colonial period of the continent began to tighten its grip around this ancient culture, the modern interpretation of the Wendigo was born. And not only that, but as science and psychology came face to face with ancient oral traditions, the exact concept of the Wendigo's cultural purpose became something else entirely. Wendigo psychosis, a historical phenomenon that is perhaps the reason why the Wendigo myth was so successful in later North American literature. In 1661, as a chronicler and missionary for the Jesuit relations made their way through North America, they came across the first documented account of Wendigo psychosis as a result of a reported case of desperation and cannibalism. As he explained, the men that he came across were afflicted with neither lunacy, hypochondria, nor frenzy, but a combination of all of these species of disease, which affects their imaginations and causes them a more than canine hunger. This makes them so ravenous for human flesh that they pounce upon women, children, and even upon men like veritable werewolves and devour them voraciously without being able to appease or glut their appetite, ever seeking fresh prey, and the more greedily, the more they eat. Whatever the interpretation of this report, it was an important moment in the later cultural significance of the Wendigo, particularly with its relation as a genuine concern for the rough and often inhospitable periods in colonial North American history. Now, the Wendigo was far more than just a creature in a far-off land, but instead a very real hardship faced in winter as the inexperienced fur trappers and settlers pushed further into the New World, hearing tales from the indigenous peoples of the land who would grew to fear it over many generations. However, one of the more famous cases of Wendigo psychosis came several hundred years later with the tale of a Plains Cree trapper named Swift Runner. During the harsh winter of 1878, Swift Runner and his family were stranded and starving in the wilderness of Saskatchewan. Soon, despite being 25 miles away from an emergency food cache of the Hudson's Bay Company, Swift Runner's eldest son perished, and shortly afterward, Swift Runner allegedly butchered and ate his wife and 5 remaining children. The case was both strange and shocking, and given that the Plains Cree trapper resorted to cannibalism in such close proximity to the emergency cache, it was later revealed that Swift Runner's actions were not the case of pure cannibalism as a dark and last resort to starvation, but rather of a man afflicted by Wendigo psychosis. And here was the inspiration for the first and very important fictional interpretation of the Wendigo myth, with a short story written by Algernon Blackwood, a tale written in the year 1910 simply titled The Wendigo, the first mainstream horror depiction of its kind. In the story, Blackwood tells the tale of 2 Scotsmen on a moose hunting trip in the wilderness of Rat Portage in northwest Ontario. They are joined on their trip by 2 guides, a man named Hank Davis and the French Canuck Joseph Defargo, alongside their native cook, a man named Punk. Although this tale is a very tame brush with the Wendigo myth of legend compared to most modern incarnations, it instead employed the first depiction of the Wendigo not just as a grotesque entity, but instead as a doppelganger which could take on the guise of a human being. Perhaps the most important convention of this story, though, is with the wisdom of the native character Punk, who recognizes all of the signs of the Wendigo and immediately gets the hell out of camp. Whatever its importance to the mainstream horror depiction of the Wendigo, Algernon Blackwood's story planted the seed of an idea in many other horror writers of the time. It would influence authors such as Howard Phillips Lovecraft and Grace Isabel Colburn, and most importantly, Auguste Derleth, who would use the concept of the Wendigo in his story, The Thing That Walked on the Wind, and later with his Cthulhu mythos entity, Ithaqua, which some of you may be familiar with. Hint, it's a giant Wendigo-looking ice revenant that roams the Arctic wastes. Sound familiar? Yeah. It would also go on to inspire an early short story of Thomas Pynchon's titled Mortality and Mercy in Vienna, first published in 1959. Here it focused on a character developing Wendigo psychosis and his development then into a psychotic serial killer. That in itself would later inspire several movies such as 1999's Ravenous, as well as several TV series such as Charmed and more recently Hannibal. Perhaps the most iconic of the modern Wendigo though is with Stephen King's version of the entity. As we briefly explained in our opening clip, it would inspire a key character in King's 1983 novel Pet Sematary, where the personification of evil in an ancient burial ground of the Micmac people was an ugly, grinning creature with yellow-grey eyes, its ears replaced by ram's horns, and its tongue pointed, decaying, and yellowed. Although not as profound as it is now, at the time, King's interpretation of the Wendigo, which in turn was an interpretation of the 19th century colonial legends coming from North America, set the template for the Wendigo's later portrayal in popular horror culture, where for the most part it completely replaced the Native American lore that had long formed the importance of the Wendigo. In 2012 though, Chippewa author Louise Erdrich had a thing or two to say about that with a novel The Roundhouse, setting the precedent for the new reinterpretation of the Wendigo myth. And here is where our path splits, because the Wendigo in many ways explains the transformation of one land to the other. For thousands of years the Wendigo served as a cultural barometer for the Algonquian people, an ever-adapting tale that formed the importance of cooperation, of restraint, of sustainability, and the dangers that came with forsaking those virtues. It painted the monster that we all ran the risk of becoming if we indulged too much in the act of greed. You see, as colonial North America expanded into these ancient territories and these settlers shifted away from the many European folk tales that had formed the basis of their society, new ones were forged, fragments of a culture that had long existed before them as they clambered to produce some sort of an identity. Whilst this identity has been interpreted in many differing ways, perhaps in most cases to their detriment, the essence behind the myth of the Wendigo has always remained the same. Be it man or monster, we all choose which side we fall on. Well, there we have it, horror fans, our dive into the rich mythos of the Wendigo myth, and believe me, there is far more to this incredibly important cultural concept than just what I've attempted to explain here. So if it's piqued your interest in any way, make sure to enjoy the legend for yourself. Tell me, have you seen the yellow sign? The King in Yellow. It's a name that you may have already heard, perhaps associated with a robed fictional figure of mystery, perhaps in a video game or a television series, a tabletop RPG, or a strange book that you read but couldn't quite remember where it was from. The King in Yellow, a symbol, a sign, a strange concept that seemingly since its incarnation over a century ago appears time and time again in the even stranger corners of cosmic horror fiction. Although the genre as a whole has been passed from pillar to post throughout the ages, one of these mysterious figures appears to be far more fluid than any other, the King in Yellow. And now that we have the bravery to peek behind the lens, let's see if we can peel back those many layers and discover just exactly where the yellow sign leads. Hello horror fans, what's going on? And once again, welcome back to the scariest channel on YouTube, Top 5 Scary Videos. As per usual, I'll be your horror host Jack Finch, as today, in our next entry of the lore explored, we cast our gaze toward the impossibly mysterious King in Yellow. Roll the clip.
I'll tell you about the Yellow King.
There it is again, that name, the Yellow King, another sign. For the curious amongst you, that scene was from the seminal season 1 of HBO's series True Detective, which is, for lack of a better term, bloody brilliant. I know I hark on about the series quite a lot, but really, season 1 of True Detective is one of the finest pieces of television ever created. That is not an overstatement, really, it's that good. But you might be thinking, hold on a minute Jack, what are you talking about? What does a modern day HBO series about Louisiana detectives have to do with the King in Yellow? You see, maybe it doesn't. But the point is, it poses a far more important question to be asked of us in this episode. Why do all of these writers seemingly feel compelled to illustrate the exact same entity? What is it about the Yellow King that has caused such a stir and sent so many ripples throughout the flat circle of time? And while it's an important point to note because this story has its fair share of twists and turns that is going to be hard, not to lose your head. But don't worry, we'll carefully read the tracks of this mysterious entity and hopefully not alert him of our presence. And whilst perhaps his first titular appearance is a good place to start in Robert W. Chambers' 1895 collection of short stories aptly named The King in Yellow, we have to first scale things back a few years earlier, to 1893, and a writer by the name of Ambrose Bierce. You see, whilst H.P. Lovecraft and Edgar Allan Poe undoubtedly set the scene with their incarnations of cosmic horror and weird fiction, it could be argued that the bizarre works and the even more bizarre life of Ambrose Bierce lay the permafrost for the ensuing sanguination of horror in literature to come. Born in 1842 to Marcus Aurelius Bierce and Laura Sherwood Bierce, the father of the family in question had quite the air for alliteration. You see, Ambrose was the 10th of 13 children, each of them given their names beginning with the letter A. Abigail, Amelia, Anne, Addison, Aurelius, Augustus, Almeda, Andrew, Albert, Arthur, Adelia, Aurelia, and of course Ambrose himself. You see, this mortal reminder of language would be a caveat in his writing career, and his financially poor but incredibly literary parents instilled in young Ambrose a deep-seated love for books and writing. But it was later on in his life that Ambrose would forge his armory for horror fiction, and in turn lay the seeds for The King in Yellow to step into our world. You see, Ambrose Bierce drew the vast majority of his inspiration from his time as an infantryman in the American Civil War of 1861, but it was at the Battle of Shiloh of 1862 where the scene was truly set. A bloody battle and a terrifying experience in Bierce's life that would have a profound influence on his literary career and his later life as a war veteran. This theme was perhaps most perfectly captured in one of Bierce's most renowned short stories, An Inhabitant of Carcosa, a place which would become incredibly important to The King in Yellow, a story told as a weird tale first published in the San Francisco Newsletter of December 25th, 1886. It details a young soldier returned from the American Civil War who awakens in the ancient, far-forgotten city of Carcosa. But of course, though Bierce had a long and fruitful literary career, which ended with one of the most infamous disappearances in literary history, one which has never been solved, may I add, what we're concerned with is a later story written by Bierce, first published on January 24th, 1891 in Wave, a short story known as Haita the Shepherd, and the first ever written document of the name Hastur, the entity that forms the basis of The King in Yellow in both cosmic horror and the later Cthulhu mythos. As Bierce would pen, in the heart of Haita, the illusions of youth had not been supplanted by those of age and experience. His thoughts were pure and pleasant, for his life was simple and his soul devoid of ambition. He rose with the sun and went forth to pray at the shrine of Hastur, the god of shepherds, who heard and was pleased. You see, in this version, Hastur is a benign god, a benevolent entity that shepherds his flock on a strange and forgotten world. It was a theme that would embody the writings of Ambrose Bierce, a convention of men having no sway over their own destinies, even in the presence of an all-powerful god. Sound familiar? It would be a welcome reception then when in 1895, Bierce's contemporary, a man named Robert William Chambers, would take up the mantle of Hastur, as well as the ancient forgotten city of Carcosa, and attribute them to a new, far more cosmic kind of form. Chambers himself was a remarkable enough figure, particularly in the age of eccentrics so familiar with the birth of weird fiction. Although not exactly a household name, Chambers was a remarkable author, and although he never earned the posthumous acclaim that his later weird fiction prodigies would gather, Chambers laid the groundwork for the Yellow King and his great old brethren. His most renowned literary works, of course, is 1895's The King in Yellow, a book of 10 short stories first published by F. Tennyson Neely, fictionally set within the confines of a mysterious play. The King in Yellow, the vague veiled story of Casilda, Camilla and the Stranger, a play that perhaps has no final act, a play that, as explained by Chambers, is cursed. Now, although not all of the 10 stories are built around the mysterious King in Yellow, the image of this entity casts a long otherworldly shadow over the book. Characters explain throughout The King in Yellow that they themselves had attempted to read the play. Some of them are forever warned away from its strange cosmic allure, others are driven completely mad by it. As explained by the character of Castaigne in the first short story of the series, The Repairer of Reputations, I remember after finishing the first act that it occurred to me that I had better stop. I started up and flung the book into the fireplace. The volume struck the barred grate and fell open on the hearth in the firelight. If I had not caught a glimpse of the opening words in the second act, I should never have finished it, but as I stooped to pick it up, my eyes became riveted to the open page, and with a cry of terror, or perhaps it was of joy so poignant that I suffered in every nerve, I snatched the thing out of the coals and crept shaking to my bedroom, where I read and reread it and wept and laughed and trembled with a horror which at times assails me yet. Now that certainly sounds familiar, the King in Yellow, but perhaps the best demonstration of the mysterious figure in question is with the fourth story of the series, The Yellow Sign. As the two protagonists of the tale detail, after having read the King in Yellow play in its entirety, night fell and the hours dragged on, but still we murmured to each other of the King and the pallid mask, and midnight sounded from the misty spires in the fog-wrapped city. We spoke of Hastur and of Casilda, while outside the fog rolled against the blank window, panes as the cloud waves roll and break on the shores of Harley. Again, sound familiar? Or better still, does that seem familiar? Perhaps the strange yellow silhouette in the corner of your vision is getting clearer, but for Howard Phillips Lovecraft, Chambers' story and the many names that came with it would be the substance that he would huff and scatter out the scented visions of his seminal works of cosmic horror. Lovecraft noted that he first read Chambers' collection in January of 1927, where he collected the many names and titles laid out before him. The Lake of Harley, the Yellow Sign, Hastur, names and places that would later become commonplace in the Cthulhu mythos. You see, perhaps the most important spark of a synapse was that Lovecraft borrowed Chambers' method of vaguely referring to supernatural events, entities and places, which he in turn borrowed from Beers, so on and so forth until the end of time. It's a flat circle. Effectively, all of these stories, Haita the Shepherd, an inhabitant of Carcosa, the King in Yellow, retroactively became another key component in the occult literature that formed the Cthulhu mythos. It was in Lovecraft's 1931 novella The Whisperer in Darkness where they were ultimately forged, where Lovecraft would link the yellow sign to that of Hastur, offering an illusion that Hastur was in fact an entity, a cosmic entity, a mystery of unfathomable scope, one that not even Lovecraft himself would attempt to fully form, and in turn pass it on to the future generations of weird fiction writers to try and comprehend, just like how it too had fallen into his lap. In 1938, a far more unlikely candidate would pick up the mantle, if only briefly, with Raymond Chandler's detective short story The King in Yellow, in which Philip Marlowe, or Steve Grace in earlier versions, finds a famous jazz trumpeter dead in his bed wearing yellow pajamas. As the detective finds the body, he mutters, "The King in Yellow. I read a book by that title once." Although only small and not connected to the Carcosa mythos in the slightest, you could argue that Raymond Chandler's use of the yellow sign perhaps exemplifies exactly what makes this incredibly unique literary anomaly so remarkably special. It's like a strange cosmic joke that has been muttered through the ages and no one yet has spilled the punchline. It also exemplifies why cosmic horror as a fictional vessel works so well. It's based upon pockets and deep-seated seams of hidden knowledge, unknowable mechanics that are left without explanation, sometimes for forever. An open-ended mystery, a yellow sign scrawled on the wall in a stray panel of a comic book series, a pallid mask in mise-en-scène, hidden only to those that don't recognize it. The name of Carcosa on a map in the appendix of a graphic novel. Still to this day, Hastur and the yellow sign are the key components in the same transposed mystery that has crawled from page to page ever since Ambrose Bierce first penned reference to it in 1893. And that's where we arrive now. Well, in the last decade anyway, right back to our first clip, season 1 of True Detective, a work of fiction that seemingly would have no other reason to pick up the Yellow King than to further the mystery in itself. And now, I'm certainly not in the business for even trying to attempt to spoil the contents of that series, because really, it needs to be seen. And well, if you're in the business of deciphering the next step in the age-old cosmic mystery of the King in Yellow, then it's certainly the next place that you'll have to look. Or well, take my word for it, it's definitely a place to start at least. The real question is though, what will be the next sign? What will be the next meaning of the yellow sign scrawled on a strange door down a dusty alleyway? Or perhaps an oddly familiar name in a video game, or the strange decoded lines in the lyrics of a song? We human beings are curious creatures, and the King in Yellow certainly knows it. Well, there we have it, horror fans, our latest entry in this Lore Explored series, and believe me, I enjoyed this one in particular. Well, what do you guys think? Do you have any other clues to offer in this age-old cosmic mystery, or just any words of wisdom of your own? Let us know your thoughts down in the comment section below. Vampires, they are back, but we're set to take the biggest bite out of them that has ever been bitten over here at Top 5 Scary Videos. We're turning the coffins and we're opening the curtains. See what I did there? Of course you did, because tooth and tongue aside, it's clear to see that the vast majority of us are vampirical fanatics, and what better way to scratch that particular itch than to dive into the very rich and intricate lore that has been documented thus far in horror history. Also, welcome to a brand new series where we're going to be doing things a little bit differently and attempt to take a longer form look at some of the most influential and important lore in literature, cinema and video games. Welcome to the Lore Explored. Hello horror fans, what's going on, and once again welcome back to the Scary channel on YouTube, Top 5 Scary Videos. As per usual, I'll be your horror host Jack Finch as we begin our brand new series by curiously taking a look at vampires in literature. Roll the clip. I mean, it might be a new series, but we're still gonna roll the clip.
The knife is old and could be dirty. It could give you blood poisoning. Please, let me do it.
The oldest remedy, and for the curious amongst you, our first flag post in the rich lore of vampire fiction is 1979's Nosferatu the Vampire, directed by the legendary filmmaker Werner Herzog, which depicts Klaus Kinski being the creepiest Count Dracula ever depicted on screen, building upon the critical surprise success of F.W. Murnau's 1922 German adaptation Nosferatu. Obviously, we can't begin this list without giving a direct nod to these bloodthirsty stalkers of the silver screen, but here, for this list, we're diving into the lore behind vampires in literature, and to do that we have to first begin with a little bit of history. You see, the term vampire wasn't actually as prolific as you may imagine, and the actual origin behind its etymology is still a matter of debate. It wasn't until 1734 that the English language first saw mention of these creatures, although some French, German, Austrian and Serbian literature contained an allusion to vampires as early as 1718, which was believed to be derived from the Slavic form for vampire. However, others believe that the Slavic languages in turn borrowed that word from a pre-existing, less assuming Turkic term which means witch, Uber. And even stranger still, there are records of that term in Old Russian that dates back to the 11th century, believed to be borrowed by the Turkish term that relates to the same ancient pagan practice, Upiri. However, the first ever mention of this term in recorded history was back in 1047, written in a letter to a Novgorodian prince which referred to him as Upir Lichij, which seemingly served to name him as an undead priest. Although not in direct correlation, it is thought that Upir Lichij would later literally translate to wicked vampire. Interesting, right? I mean, the ancient etymology of it, not the fact that a secret kingdom of bloodthirsty pagan priests may have existed somewhere in ancient Russia. Now, semantics aside, the exact notion of vampirism has existed in folklore for millennia, passed down through means of spiritual texts and oral tradition. Albeit much more demonic in origin, the ancient Mesopotamians, the Hebrews, ancient Greeks and Romans all had tales of creatures that we would consider to be a precursor to the modern vampire. In these many tales of ancient belief, the act of blood drinking was actually quite prolific, and often attributed to demons and spirits that would eat flesh and, well, drink blood. In fact, pretty much every nation on earth has had some form of blood drinking undead revenant or demon, which in some cases even acted as a deity to several ancient belief systems. You see, it's no wonder that the very essence of the vampire has long been ingrained in our cultural psyche. However, it wasn't until the late 17th and 18th centuries where these same shared cultural fears would begin to make themselves apparent, shall we say. The very tales that form the basis of the vampire legend that would later go on to form the literature behind vampirism first entered into historical record in 1672 with the case of Yuri Grando, a peasant that had died 6 years previous but had seemingly arisen from his grave to drink the blood of local villagers in Istria, which is now modern Croatia. After the strange case of Yuri Grando, Eastern Europe saw a frenzy of these same vampire sightings, the most famous being that of Petar Blavovic and Arnold Paul, both of which were Serbian peasants, a potential explanation for the Proto-Slavic origin of the term vampire. Now, the actual means of the sociological phenomena behind these historical events, if any, are a matter for a different video, because the point is, it injected a shared cultural belief that would quickly form the basis of one of the most important and impactful conventions in horror fiction: vampires. Because in 1748, during a time where these alleged vampire attacks were still happening across Eastern Europe, a German man named Heinrich August Ossenfelder manifested that very same zeitgeist and produced a poem simply titled Der Vampir. the Vampire. An incredibly short poem which is written from the perspective of a mysterious man presented as a jilted and aggressive seducer that lusts for a respectable and pious Christian girl who is protected by her mother. In it, the term vampire is only addressed twice, with "as in vampires unmortal, folk on the Theses portal," and in "till I myself avenging to a vampire's health, a drinking him toast impale to K." Although the poem itself is a direct metaphor for the desecration of religious faith, it goes on to directly describe breaking through the girl's bedroom window and sucking her blood. Where have we heard that one before, right? And in fact, the stark eroticism of Ossenfelder's poem would go on to influence many other pieces of vampire literature that followed it. Several decades later, in 1773, another German poet, a man named Gottfried August Berger, would produce a poem titled Lenore, an incredibly important landmark in literature and a vital entry into the Gothic ballads, but a poem that never exactly used the term vampire. Instead, it was responsible for creating another key theme that would later appear in vampire literature: immortality, or in this case, undeath, the ability for vampires to rise from their graves in the darkness of midnight, enter the homes of their victims or loved ones, and then carry them away into the night. After the widespread publication of Lenore, the Gothic ideal of the vampire was well and truly afoot, and the following few decades produced several similar pieces of literature such as The Bride of Corinth, Therbala the Destroyer, Percy Shelley's The Spectral Horseman, as well as Samuel Taylor Coleridge's famously unfinished ballad Christabel. However, it wasn't until the year 1819 where vampire literature really began to become solidified, when a man named John Polidori created the first prose piece of vampire fiction ever: The Vampire. It featured the iconic Lord Ruthven, the character of which was actually based upon Polidori's good friend and patient, the notorious Lord Byron. Now, whilst Byron also had a stab of his own at vampire literature, this was the first moment in literature where a fully formed vampire character would emerge, but more importantly, it served to paint Lord Ruthven as an anti-hero, seemingly down to Polidori's admiration for the whims of his friend Byron, which would form the basis of a trope rarely seen in horror or Gothic fiction, but would go on to become a key component of its themes, that of the sympathetic villain, the anti-hero. Now, how many likeable vampires can we name now in popular fiction? There's just too many of them, and all of them the heroes or heroines of their own stories, but back then, this was cutting edge stuff, or cutting teeth, I guess. The impact that Polidori's work had on vampire literature was huge, and throughout the 19th century, the masses couldn't get enough of our blood-sucking contemporaries. In fact, one of the most impactful methods of disseminating fiction in the mid-19th century were the classic Victorian-era Gothic pulp pieces, Penny Dreadful. Short, easily distributed pamphlets that gave rise to the essence of serialized horror, returning characters that formed their own anthologies, a visual tapestry that I'm sure we're all familiar with. Well, from 1845 to 1847, the second most popular vampire since Lord Ruthven snarled onto the scene: Varney the Vampire, a character created by James Reimer and Thomas Peckett Prest that successfully managed to encapsulate all of the same vampiric themes laid out before him, and thus gave rise to the popular depictions of the vampire: long cloaks, high collars, drinking blood, coffins. But there was another story that paved the way for vampire literature before we address the very evident elephant left in the room that we haven't yet talked about. A lesser known addition into the Gothic canon of vampirism, but one that is without a doubt even more important than Varney the Vampire. And that was with Sheridan Le Fanu's 1871 novella Carmilla. And this was the first ever depiction of a female vampire, Countess Karnstein. In many ways, Countess Karnstein paved the way for the defining moment of vampire literature, and her influence as a symbol of occultism, as well as the enigmatic, supernatural, almost deified creature that exists separate from the confines of civilization. It's one of the most important hallmarks for vampire fiction and Gothic literature as a whole, because the character of Countess Karnstein was pretty much the archetype for the most important piece of vampire literature ever created, Bram Stoker's Dracula. And without detracting from both pieces, the similarities between the two are staggeringly clear. You see, it isn't with the actual inception of Bram Stoker's 1897 novel Dracula that we need to cast our gaze towards, because it was with the impact that matters, and it goes without saying that there is no greater effort in history to depict vampires in popular fiction as influential and as definitive as Dracula. Whatever the case, at the time time of its release, it struck a chord across Victorian Europe, perhaps stirring up an ancient shared cultural fear that had long lingered within us all. Vampires in literature are the amalgamation of many things, a collection of one convention here and another there, but the point of them remains the same. They are both a blessing and a curse. They're what we want to be and what we want to defeat. And Bram Stoker's Dracula was the compendium behind that very specific horror. As Howard Phillips Lovecraft once wrote, that which is not dead can eternal lie, and with strange eons even death may die. You see, in this capacity, the incomprehensible scope of cosmic horror was once immortalized by the many comings and goings and wants and needs of the old gods, a concept which never could be fully grasped by the human mind. But it was a passage written in a book that harkens back to the ultimate adversary of all human life: death, the Necronomicon, the book of the dead, and one which played on a symbolic device that has been scrawled on the pages of literature since time immemorial. That of the necromancer, the human host that blurs the boundaries between the spirit world and ours. So in that case, let's see what they're all about. Hello horror fans, what's going on? And once again, welcome back to the Scary channel on YouTube, Top 5 Scary Videos. As per usual, I'll be your horror host Jack Finch, as today we once more return to the lore explored and take a curious look at the necromancer. Roll the clip. For the curious amongst you, that clip of course was from The Hobbit, The Desolation of Smaug, and in my eyes, anything, book, movie, game, whatever, that is set in Middle-earth can do no wrong. Fact. But hey, it also depicted an incredibly unique concept, that of Sauron as the necromancer, a fledgling essence of the shadow before his whole campaign of hate and torment, one that wasn't exactly laid down in the Lord of the Rings series, but instead only hinted at by J.R.R. Tolkien 100 years prior. Put a pin in that because Sauron is an incredibly important figure in the fictional lore of the necromancer, but again, it was an even older archetypal image, one that has happened time and time again in mythology, folklore, religion, literature, tabletop board games. The necromancer is as old as storytelling itself, and before we dive into the bulk of their lore, it's probably best that we find out where they first began. So first and foremost, what's in a word? Because while it may seem slightly obvious, the etymology behind the necromancer is the first and most important stop in deciphering the origin of those that speak with the dead. The word necromancy is adapted from the late Latin necromantia, which in itself is borrowed from the post-classical Greek necromenteia, a compound of the ancient Greek nekros, which means dead body, and manteia, which loosely translates to divination by means of, a diviner of those that are dead. Now, whilst the first ever use of this word occurred in a treatise known as Origin of Alexandria in the 3rd century AD, the actual origin of the classical Greek term Nicaea was even older still. It appeared in perhaps one of the most famous texts of the ancient world, the Odyssey, written by Homer and completed sometime around the 8th century BC, denoting an ancient Greek cult ceremonial practice known as Nicaea, a rite by which ghosts were called upon and questioned about the future. And whilst this certainly seems to be the most important starting point for our journey through necromancy in literature, still the form and function of this practice is older than even that. Because you see, the role of the necromancer walks hand in hand with another archetypal role, that of the shaman. And don't worry, because we certainly can't cover the whole extent of the shaman as merely a footnote in a video, and we'll be taking a much deeper look at them in their own lore explored in good time. The point is, it is important to note that the necromancer is certainly an offshoot of the shaman, and it harkens back to an ancient cultural practice that seemingly has made up an integral part of all human beings, and in turn, all life on Earth. Veneration of the dead, as well as the physical, metaphysical, or spiritual communion with those that have passed over, is perhaps one of the oldest core beliefs of human existence. It would make sense then that evidence of this necromancy was prevalent throughout the ancient world, particularly in ancient Egypt, Babylonia, Greece, and Rome. Several allusions are made in ancient records of classical necromancers addressing the dead in a mixture of high-pitched squeaking and low droning noises, comparable to the trance-like mutterings of shamanism, which suggests further that the origins of necromancy are indeed one and the same with shamanism, or at least comprised of similar rites. In his encyclopedic work Geographica, written by Greek academic and philosopher Strabo around 7 BC, he refers to the necromantia, or diviners of the dead, as the foremost leading practitioners of divination amongst the people of Persia. In short, necromancy was at the forefront of religion in much of the ancient world, and it is believed to have also been widespread amongst the people of Chaldea, Etruria, and most importantly Babylonia, where Babylonian necromancers were denoted as Manzazu or Shah Itemu, and the spirits that they raised were called Itemu. Once again, evidence of an ancient practice, communication with the dead. And here we can bring it back to Homer's Odyssey, where these themes come to the forefront of ancient literature. In the Odyssey, under the direction of the powerful sorceress Circe, the hero Odysseus travels to the bowels of the earth, to the underworld, in order to gain an insight into his impending voyage home. Most importantly, he seeks a lost knowledge, one that could not be revealed without the wisdom of the dead. That's an important theme. By using the practice of spells that Circe taught him, Odysseus wishes to invoke and question the shade of Tiresias, the blind prophet of Thebes, but is unable to summon the seer spirit without the aid of others. Even more astoundingly, eventually Odysseus commits fully to the necromantic ritual, where he then performs the rites of the dead around a pit and fire, sacrifices the blood of animals, and recites prayers and incantations to the ghosts and gods of the underworld. As clear as it could ever be, communion with the spirit world, Odysseus as the necromancer. Most importantly, this rite and practice of Nicaea would later form the psychological and philosophical incarnation of the necromancer that we now know, particularly in horror and fantasy literature. This image was perhaps best elaborated on by the psychoanalytic works of Carl Jung, who equated Nicaea and necromancy as the allegorical night sea journey, a metaphorical descent into the lower world, with the ultimate prize being a new, darker knowledge of the self. In many ways, the classical hero's journey was superseded by the night sea journey, an ultimate descent into the dark depths of the human consciousness, one where, compared to the cathartic process of the hero, here there is no coming back. You see, the basic practice of necromancy in ancient Greece and the wider ancient world was more of a solicitation of the dead rather than any form of exploitation. The general rite of the classical communication of the spirit world, as laid out by Odysseus, was for a figure to dig a pit, make a fire in it, offer honey, milk, wine, and then lay out the sacrifice of an animal, along with prayers to the chthonic gods such as Hecate. Throughout pretty much all of the ancient world, this practice appears time and time again in some form or another, and is one that literally became the cornerstone for a myriad of belief systems. Old Norse, Gnosticism, paganism, many necromantic rites were sacrament to them, and over hundreds of years this dead-speaking function shifted and changed with the times. So then you may be scratching your head and thinking, where does the evil image of the necromancer first occur? I was expecting flowing black robes, bone white hair, and an army of skeletal archers. And the answer to that question was forged in perhaps one of the most tumultuous times in European history, the Middle Ages, and the role that the Catholic Church played in shifting the tide in the continued cultural development of necromancy. You see, not surprisingly, the Abrahamic religions took a pretty dismal view of the practice, and condemnation of necromantic rites is explicitly referred to on many occasions in their religious texts. In the Bible, it is very clearly denoted as a dark art, but strangely enough, it wasn't ever a practice that was completely eradicated by the Church. In fact, throughout the Middle Ages, despite the Church being the principal advocates for its condemnation, it was the clergy who inadvertently sustained its practice, albeit by driving it underground and in turn augmenting its cultural evolution. You see, the Church didn't outright destroy necromancy, but instead refused to believe that anyone but their Abrahamic God had the power to resurrect a body or even intentionally contact a spirit. And because of that, the Church concluded that these ancient necromancers weren't actually communicating with the dead, but instead with demons, a host of nefarious forces who would deceive the magicians into believing that they were the souls of the dead. And now perhaps the image of the necromancer as a corrupted scholar or warlock owes itself as the far more nefarious archetype in contemporary literature. This is where we get the far more contemptuous conventions of the necromancer: blood sacrifices, puppets, voodoo dolls, protective circles, letters, and sigils. The image of the necromancer almost as a warrior rather than a shaman, bending the will of the metaphorical demon of the dead to do do their bidding rather than to gain a lost knowledge like Odysseus did in the underworld. Throughout the 1300s, reports of necromancy as a practice fell on either side of the moral and cultural line. Rare confessions of necromancy by those that were accused seemed to suggest that there was a range of what was and wasn't acceptable in relation to communing with the dead. John of Salisbury is perhaps one of the most famous historical examples of this, a philosopher accused of necromancy after a royal scandal. So was the case of Richard Kieckhefer in 1332, who was accused of necromancy after being connected to a group who were plotting to invoke the demon Beric from inside a circle made from strips of cat skin. Yeah, it seemed that the ancient message may have been a little bit lost in translation. You see, the Middle Ages truly were a grey area as to what was and what wasn't acceptable in terms of ceremonial magic, and many of these grey areas are what have laid the basis for esoteric knowledge in modern culture and literature. You see, it didn't end there though, and it was with the rise of spiritualism throughout the 1800s where the image of the necromancer once again shifted, this time toward a kinder, more gentler form of communing with the dead. This is where the seance came to the forefront of popular practice, and instead of dead bodies as laid out by the necromancy of the Middle Ages, this time it was live mediums that acted as conduits for the dead. Now, whilst this was a historical period that was certainly rife with charlatans and grifters who would seek to exploit the shared reverence for the dead that has seemingly been ingrained in our cultural psyche since the dawn of time for monetary gain, it is also part of the gothic connotations of necromancy that are so common today. Skulls, candles, shadow ceremonies, tapping the bones. Throughout the turn of the 19th century and later still, necromancy literally got a facelift, and part of that facelift is the archetypal necromancer that we understand in today's popular culture. But beneath the bones, the form and function remains the same. And this is where it is difficult to pinpoint, because when we look at modern literature, video games, tabletop and television included, the necromancer is at times all of these very same archetypes laid out throughout history. Whether it is the playable character class in the Diablo series, an orchestrator of the dead who harnesses the corpses of the deceased to do their bidding, the unwitting Ash in Sam Raimi's Army of Darkness, or even in Brian Lumley's Necroscope series, where the necromancer is instead augmented back to its original form as an individual who can communicate with the dead as equals rather than adversaries, all of them remain the same. Reverence of the dead is a tale as old as time, but deep beneath that core belief system is a far more important cultural reminder. Those that forget history are doomed to repeat it, and the dead keep it. Alright guys, after our dive into the King in Yellow, I've wanted to do something like this for quite some time. It's strange because we as fans of literature, cinema and culture, although perhaps we aren't always conscious of it, are constantly borrowing tropes and conventions, small little fragments of a theme or an idea, and then adding them onto our own pile of our own interpretation of things. Our world of forms, just like how the famed authors of cosmic horror, Ambrose, Chambers, Lovecraft and their ilk would pass down the true titles or misnomers of their own terrifying great old ones, so too do we, intrinsically, instinctively borrowing from the rich tapestry laid out before us. But at what point do these things lose their identity? At what point do they become something new? Well, let's board the ship of Theseus and see what remains. Hello horror fans, what's going on? And once again, welcome back to the Scary channel on YouTube, top 5 scary videos. As per usual, I'll be your horror host Jack Finch. Today, in our next entry in our Lore Explored series, we break apart the components of the legendary ship of Theseus. Roll the clip.
So you brandish your axe.
That's the axe that slayed me.
Is he right?
For the curious amongst you, of course, that clip was from 2012's John Dies at the End, adapted and directed for the silver screen by Don Cascarelli, but based upon the incredible 2007 novel of the same name by David Wong. And for the astute amongst you, you'll understand that John Dies at the End, both the novel and the film open with a very similar and familiar paradox: the grandfather's axe. As it states, solving the following riddle will reveal the awful truth of the universe, assuming you do not go utterly mad in the attempt. Say you have an axe, just a cheap one from Home Depot, and one bitter winter day you use said axe to behead a man. Don't worry, the man's already dead and he's a Nazi zombie, so it's okay. On the last swing the handle splinters, you now have a broken axe. Now say if you replace the handle of that axe and then a year later you used it again to chop some strange eldritch creature that had crawled into your kitchen into pieces, but in the process, unfortunately, you chipped the head of the axe, and again you had to replace it at the hardware store. But as soon as you get home with your newly repaired axe, the same Nazi zombie from before shambles in front of your front door. When you brandish your axe high in the air, he wheezes, "That's the axe that slayed me." Is he right? Now, interestingly enough, for those of you that have read David Wong's phenomenal novel, then you'll also understand that he had written in some form of paradoxical failsafe to this mind-bending equation. And although I won't spoil it, because really, read John dies at the end, it forms the overarching theme of that same paradoxical and thought-provoking novel. But also, as you will learn throughout the confines of this lore explored, David Wong was simply highlighting one of the oldest thought experiments in human history, the ship of Theseus. And for those of you still scratching your heads wondering what the hell this whole Nazi zombie axe beheading opening gambit is all about, let's set the scene a little bit more. In the metaphysics of identity, the ship of Theseus is a thought experiment that raises the question of whether an object that has had all of its components replaced fundamentally remains to be the same object. It is one of, if not perhaps the oldest philosophical concepts in Western philosophy, and it is one that still manages to shake off the cobwebs of human thought to this day. It was first posited by Plutarch in his 1st century biography, Life of Theseus, discussing the life and works of the mythical Greek king of antiquity and founder of the Kingdom of Athens, although the same concept had been long discussed by Plato and Heraclitus as early as 400 BC, although we'll get to that later. Now, the titular ship in question was a famous vessel said to have been sailed by the hero Theseus himself during a great battle of the ages and had been kept in the harbour of Athens as a museum piece. As the years went by, the wooden parts began to rot and be replaced by new ones, and scholarly minds such as Plato and Heraclitus, well, it got them thinking. The thought experiment later laid out by Plutarch, though, goes a little something like this. A ship goes out in a storm and is damaged. Upon returning to the shore, the ship is repaired, with the parts of it being replaced in the process. Again and again, the same ship goes out to sea, and again it is repaired, until one day, eventually, every single component on the ship, every single plank of wood and nail has been replaced. Is the repaired ship still the same ship that first went out into that first storm? And yet, if it isn't, at what point did it become a different ship? Say you collected every single part of that ship that was discarded during your repairs and used them all to rebuild another ship. If you place the two ships side by side, which one of them would be the true ship of Theseus? Or instead, would it be both of them? Or would it be neither? You see, much like David Wong's axe, and with the same concept of the grandfather's axe laid down before that, what these paradoxical notions bring into question are the fragilities of identity over time. But hold that thought for a moment, because if you're pondering as to how this metaphysical notion of identity can only ever be applicable to inanimate objects like ships and axes, just take a look at yourself for a moment. In many ways, at many levels, biologically, consciously, physically, in some senses, we are the ship of Theseus. Within the span of 7 years, every single cell of our bodies will die and be replaced without us ever realizing it. Intrinsically, over that period, continuously, we are literally not the same person that we once were. And if that is the case, then it poses a far more pressing explanation for the human mind to require. If the very essence of we as human beings is replaced just as easy as the planks of a ship or the handles of an axe, then where lies our identity? What part of our psyche remains behind? What makes us us? Now, please don't expect any form of an answer for this video, because even the musings of some of the greatest philosophical minds in human history have struggled to wrestle with the ship of Theseus, but still, it is a pattern that has emerged time and time again across the ages, throughout history, in culture and art, video games, entertainment. It is the core component of the passage of storytelling behind all of the fragments of thoughts and ideas passed on from person to person, from artist to artist, and monster to monster. Take, for example, Frankenstein's monster, penned by Mary Shelley, and perhaps the most clear and present example of the ship of Theseus in horror literature. Although Shelley's novel is told through 3 separate first-person accounts, the second of them, The Tale of Frankenstein himself, lays out what it means for the human mind to ponder on what we're made from. As that portion of the novel explains, Frankenstein lived a happy childhood with his young mother after she marries the older and reputable Alphonse Frankenstein, a man who has already seen the change of seasons of his own life. Frankenstein is afforded a brilliant education, giving him the chance to try and decipher all of the secrets of heaven and earth. He studies both natural philosophy and alchemy, and as a scientific mind does, he seeks to unravel the core components of what makes a human human, what makes a man a man. And in doing so, as we know, and as Shelley pens, he perverses the sanctity of creation, and by compiling the components of the dead in the pursuit of engineering the human form instead of the beautiful image that Frankenstein expected, he is disgusted and reviled by his own creation. What is most interesting about this example in horror literature, though, are the actions that the creature later takes. Although compiled of nothing but spare parts, the monster teaches himself to read, and with literature he begins to display a human consciousness, facing the existential question of who or what he is. Now, as compared to the ship of Theseus in that regard, it would suggest that no matter the physical form the psyche takes, it is merely a vessel, a ship. But here what Frankenstein errs upon is the notion that there is no ship. In conceptualism, the ship does not exist, but is merely a label for a particular organization of matter and energy in relation to time and space. In that sense, Frankenstein's monster had exactly the same right to exist as Frankenstein himself did. He is arranged of the same parts, just in a different order. They are both the same ship, side by side. But again, if that sounds familiar, take a more popular example, one that employs a much more technological aspect of the monster and the ship. In 1983's Return of the Jedi, Luke Skywalker and the Force ghost of Obi-Wan ponder on what shreds of humanity Darth Vader has left behind, and whether it was possible that the man, Anakin Skywalker, could still be redeemed. In making his point, Obi-Wan states that Vader is more machine than man. All of his parts have been replaced, his biological presence stripped away and restructured by something entirely different. Now, is he the same? Or what about the remarkable Altered Carbon series, both the brilliant 2002 cyberpunk novel by Richard K. Morgan, as well as the awesome 2018 Netflix adaptation of the same name? Hey, you could even argue that the novelization to television is a ship of Theseus in itself, but whatever. Instead of direct physical replacements though, what Altered Carbon tackles is the notion of replacing the body entirely, slipping in and out of skin suits like one would try on a new coat. What Richard Morgan delivers in his novel is the idea of stacks, a physical representation that stores human consciousness, and sleeves, interchangeable bodies that have become the societal norm in the far future. In Altered Carbon, it tackles the idea of the incredibly wealthy being able to live multiple lifespans, essentially conquering immortality by fabricating their own biological bodies over and over again. In that sense, if the ship of Theseus was put through a metaphorical manufacturing plant, would the process still hold up against the notion of the self? Where do we draw the line in the thingness of a thing, especially when we apply it to something as sacred as the human body? The phenomenal Ghost in the Shell tackles a similar theme, and yet instead argues the paradox of a human being as alive even when synthetic. Or to bring things back down to earth, take for example the remarkable 2013 novel S, written by Doug Dorst and conceived by J.J. Abrams, which is one of the most mind-bending and entertaining pieces of literature that you could ever hope to tackle. In terms of meta-fiction, considering we're talking about meta-philosophy, S is a book inside a book inside a book, a theme similar to House of Leaves by Mark Danielewski, although this one takes it to a whole new level. S is presented in the form of a novel called Ship of Theseus, written by an elusive author named V.M. Straka and published back in 1949, and yet inside that publication are the annotations of two collaborative readers who have both read this book before we have, the reader, and have both tried and failed to decipher its many mysteries. Whilst being an incredible novel that you should certainly read, it also manages to literally tackle the same thought experiment of the Ship of Theseus, and yet it goes one further. If we were to annotate it and leave it for someone else to read and then annotate, would it be the same book that we read? Now, there have been similar themes tackled throughout history, particularly with Vladimir Nabokov's 1962 novel Pale Fire, but it harkens back to so many other literary mysteries and curiosities that it's certainly evident of how much sway the Ship of Theseus holds over our own unconscious thought. Take Shakespeare, for example, and the eternal historical mystery as to who actually was responsible for his body of work. Was it a single person, William Shakespeare, or was it a group of people all adding different parts of the same components? If it was revealed, would it even matter? Would the Ship of Theseus that Shakespeare had created remain the same? You see, in terms of science fiction and horror, recent shows such as Black Mirror and Westworld have strived to tackle these exact same themes. In this age of mass production and technological abundance, deciphering what an identity means is an ever-present urge for our society. It is one that has found its way once again to the forefront of our culture, and it is one that remains to be answered in its entirety. The Witcher, As the monstrum tome explains to the common people of the world, indeed there is nothing more repulsive than these monsters that defy nature and are known by the name of Witcher, as they are the offspring of foul sorcery and witchcraft. They are unscrupulous scoundrels without conscience and virtue, veritable creatures from hell, capable only of taking lives. In other words, they sound pretty damn villainous, right? So why would Andrzej Sapkowski dedicate his entire series of fantasy novels to such a monstrous creation? Isn't this a time for heroes? How can such a hated figure lead the path to righteousness and virtue, protector of the weak and innocent? Well, it's probably high time that we found out. Hello horror fans, what's going on? And once again, welcome back to the Scary Channel on YouTube, top 5 scary videos. As per usual, I'll be your horror host Jack Finches. Today, we resume our Lore Explored series, and to my sheer joy, we take a look at The Witcher. Roll the clip.
I remember hearing stories about witches. Is it true what they say?
For the curious amongst you, that clip was of course from the up and coming Netflix series starring Henry Cavill as the Witcher himself, Geralt of Rivia. And you know, I'm actually pretty stoked about it, and I'm fairly confident that Netflix and Cavill as a whole are going to do a great job. And if you're asking me, anything that furthers this remarkable and fantastic world is worthy of note. But I'm also of the mind that in my head canon there is only one Butcher of Blaviken, and he exists in CD Projekt Red's near perfect video game series voiced by Doug Cockle. I hope to be proved wrong, but yeah.
Been through hell and high water, you and me. Fact is, you know me better than anyone else does.
Anyway, housekeeping aside, let's dive into this Lore Explored, because we're going to be doing things a little differently with this episode. Instead of covering the series as a whole and necessarily focusing on the larger themes, we're going to be focusing on the exact role of the Witcher in this fantasy world, where they came from, their purpose as an organization, and anything else that comes with being the mutagenic anti-heroes that they are. Personally, I think the best way to explore Sapkowski's world is through the eyes of a Witcher. Well, the cat's eyes of a Witcher, but we'll get to that. First and foremost, I should probably not get too ahead of myself, because if you can't tell, I'm very excited, and for the non-Witcher fanatics amongst you, we should first give a little overview as to what we're dealing with. Back in 1993, Polish author Andrzej Sapkowski released his first novel in the Witcher series, The Last Wish. It introduced to us an intriguing character, Geralt of Rivia, a mysterious man who had been terribly injured in battle and was resting at the temple of Melitele, being tended by mute servants whilst recounting many of the violent paths that had led him there. Unlike many other fantasy novels, this one was a collection of short stories interwoven by Geralt's continued mystery whilst establishing one particular thing very, very clearly. This guy Geralt, yeah, he's seen some shit. And that, horror fans, is merely the beginning, because as is revealed in the edge of the world, Geralt of Rivia is part of an ancient order whose role in this bloodthirsty world is to hunt down the many monsters of folklore and legend that plague the countryside or linger in deep forgotten caverns, making the world a better place one decapitated wyvern's head at a time. But of course, only for a price. And that price is important, because now we can talk about exactly what it takes to join this hazardous profession and the many pros and cons that come with it. But to comprehend that, we need to first understand where they came from, and truth be told, that's a difficult thing to do, because part of the allure of the Witcher series is that the origin of these mysterious mercenaries is so ancient, so rooted in a world that once was, that this new world, the one that they protect without question, has forgotten them. And in turn, you could say that the purpose behind the traditions of the Witcher order have been forgotten even by themselves. You see, it's a key theme that is thread throughout Sapkowski's series, the overwhelming antiquity of the world that it takes place in. But there is a reason for that, because we do know one thing, and we may have an inkling as to just exactly why the Witchers came into being. Maybe. Anyway, you see, around 1500 years before Sapkowski's series takes place, an event occurred, an event known as the Conjunction of the Spheres, a cataclysm which converged a myriad of multi-dimensional worlds and essentially forged them together into one. The one here in question, where the series takes place. You see, the native races to that world, the elder races, were the gnomes, the most ancient, the dwarves and the elves, but their existence was interrupted by this event. Soon came a horde of unnatural creatures from the fragments of the multiverse. Ghouls, gravers, vampires, ancient spirits of shadow and fire and ice. But it wasn't just monsters that emerged too, but men. The race of humans soon appeared, their old world destroyed by the conjunction of the spheres, dazed and confused and without a home. Well, during that time, these first settlers spread to the north of their strange new home, partly being taught by their elven neighbours how to wield chaos as magic, but only a select few, because come on, they don't just hand out magic willy-nilly. You see, when these tired and hopeless settlers futilely attempted to colonise these new, untamed lands filled with monsters and murder, they needed protecting. An elite caste of warrior monks gradually began to emerge from their ranks, human defenders who braved the wilds by sheer will alone, and soon found that other ancient magics lurked there. Out in the wilderness, these warrior monks studied these strange mushrooms and fungi that grew there. They documented herbs and plant stimulants, and soon they took that knowledge and created concoctions that gave them a bold advantage against these monsters. However, they also noticed something strange. They noticed that the bodies of their young apprentices developed superhuman speed and endurance. Well, the ones that survived anyway, because you see, this is where a concept known as the trial of the grasses emerges, the most important initiation rite to becoming a witcher, rooted in their humble beginnings as herbalists and alchemists. And when I say important, I really mean it, because there are only two options with the trial of the grasses. You pass it and become a witcher, or you die, with 7 out of 10 candidates usually dying in the process. Ultimately, this alchemical process is integral to the Order of the Witcher. It mutates their genes permanently, imbibing them with heightened senses, strength, reflexes, and resistances to essentially all disease. In other terms, they literally become a monster in order to fight them, sacrificing their humanity to become a mutant specifically built to hunt and kill all inhuman prey across their strange new world. As a result of this painful and dangerous process, the young survivors would gain cat-like eyes whose pupils would dilate to see in the most blinding of light or the darkest of darkness. Sensing a metaphor there. As you may imagine, at the origin of this order, it was frighteningly effective, but the price to be paid was staggering. First and foremost, all witches would become sterile, making it impossible for them to pass on their traits, but also instilling them with an incredibly long lifespan and prolonged youth, often existing for several centuries and only ever appearing as middle-aged men at the most. This unnatural life cycle laid down the foundation that would make the common folk of the world so weary and hateful of these individuals, despite these witches being the only line of defense that they had against the horrors that lingered in the darkness. You see, soon after the trial of the grasses seemed to be a viable option for combating these monsters. You remember those magic studying aristocrats that I mentioned before? Yeah, by that time the Nordling monarchy realised that they could use these newly created mutant knights to bend toward their will, and gave them the basis to form their order, finalising the set of trials and mutations that would pave the way toward future generations of young apprentices becoming witchers. But that was merely a footnote, and the elven mages behind the monarchy, as well as their new human mages, realised that they couldn't really do anything with these poison-drinking warrior monks after all, and so quickly they pulled a plug on their order. Despite that though, the witches that remained trudged on, and so splintered and abandoned by the new monarchy, they carved out the body of their order and the many differing schools that would then form the basis of them. You see, sometime between the Order of the Witcher developing their ranks after they splintered from the monarchy, their membership realised that there were many ways to fight these monsters, and all of them didn't entirely agree on the same approach. They realised that spreading themselves into different areas and thus specialising in the art of monster hunting would strengthen their cause and also earn them a pretty penny in the process. This act built the basis of the 7 known schools of the Witchers. Now, as a footnote, there are potentially more, but like we said, there are more mysteries in this series than Andrzej Sapkowski would like to admit. Now, perhaps the most prominent of these schools, and the one that Geralt of Rivia belongs to, is the School of the Wolf, whose ancestral stronghold is in the mountains of Kaer Morhen in Kedwin. In its days of glory, the School of the Wolf was perhaps the most recognised of all of the Witcher schools, with its members quickly gaining the renowned reputation of professional and reliable monster slayers. Geralt is good for a reason. Eventually being led by the wise and noble Vesemir, who would serve to be the sagely master of Geralt himself. Next there was the School of the Cat, a group of ragtag witches whose headquarters originally being in Stygia before they were cast out were anything from stationary. And at the time of Geralt they are located in the travelling caravan in the southern region of Dinmarth. Now the School of the Cat is incredibly interesting, as unlike many of their counterparts, this group eventually grew to embrace their repressed emotions and began killing for a cause and a purpose other than coin. They would become assassins lingering in royal courts to supposedly bring about a plot of Witcher dominance, and because of that fear ultimately led to their downfall. The monarchy was so weary of the School of the Cat that they sent an entire army to slaughter them, destroying their stronghold of Stygia and casting them out on the road, seeking a new sort of vengeance. Then there is the Order of the Viper, located in the deep chasms of Tir Toker, who were essentially extinct at the time of Geralt, although I'm saying nothing because these witches are a different breed entirely, and writing them off isn't the wisest of moves. The Order of the Viper are perhaps the most alien and secretive of all of their kind, who dedicated their lives to collecting and compiling ancient tomes and scrolls on the antiquities of the ancient world and the conjunction of the spheres that predated them. And yeah, that's pretty much all there is to these guys. Vipers usually means mystery, I guess. Of course there is the School of the Bear, a group who hold a special place in my heart, mainly because these guys are just unbridled badasses. Located in the keep of Hen Kaduk in Amal, deep in the mountainous region of the world, the School of the Bear sought solace with the elder races of the world, establishing ancient contacts with the dwarves and gnomes that called this region their home. Despite that though, the School of the Bear saw a solitary path, roaming the world, heavily fortified in their armour, taking things slowly and decimating anything foolish enough to step into their path. You see, although at the time of Geralt the School of the Bear is thought to be extinct, it's heavily suggested that they are. Bears are solitary creatures after all. And then there's the Griffin School, the one order of witches that maintained the same knightly values laid out by the monarchy after their poorly conceived experiment. Little is known about them other than the fact that they're obsessed with magic and have a habit of killing every and any griffin in any given region. And then finally there's the School of the Manticore, and really guys, that one is anyone's guess, because the School of the Manticore is of a different world, shall we say. You see, all of these laid the foundation for the very concept of the Witcher. These figures weren't just blustering knights who had a sword and a divine purpose. These were an order of protectors, human beings who saw that the only way to combat evil and darkness that lingered in the wilderness was to become a part of it, to adapt, to learn the ways of their enemies and use it against them. Listen guys, I could talk about the Witcher series as a whole for an entire day, week, maybe a month. And maybe we'll be doing just that depending on the direction that this series takes. But if you haven't been able to tell by now, if you haven't taken a look into this fantastic and vivid lore, you certainly should. Whether it's Sapkowski's series, the video game interpretations, or heck, even the 2001 Hexa series. Peek your head into this strange and mysterious world, conjoin your spheres, and I'm certain you'll like what you see. Let me ask you a question. Have you ever been walking through a busy street when all of a sudden out of the corner of your eye you caught sight of someone you know well slipping past in the crowd? An old friend, a distant cousin, but then your heart sinks. It's not them, it's just their doppelganger, their spitting image. You see, it's a disposable phrase that we often use, a throwaway term of endearment, to let someone know that we were thinking of them. After all, there are only a certain number of faces in the world, right? The thing is though, there is a far more sinister undertone to this conversational piece. The fear of the South is a very difficult concept to approach. Deep down in the inner recesses of our mind, the most obscure and most challenging fear to face is our own image. Let's see where it all came from. Hello horror fans, what's going on? And once again, welcome back to the Scary Channel on YouTube, Top 5 Scary Videos. As per usual, I'll be your horror host Jack Finch, as today we continue our Lore Explored series and take a look at the origins of the doppelganger. Roll the clip. For the curious amongst you, that scene of course was from 2019's Us, written and directed by Jordan Peele in his sophomore sequence as a horror tour de force, and one film in particular that managed to take the concept of the doppelganger, put it through the modern horror machine, and then take it to the next damn level. As a side note, that whole scene is brilliantly well made, and yeah, whilst that movie is pretty damn awesome and worthwhile of your attention, it also gave us The Tethered, and we'll talk about those guys in good time, because by that point we may be looking at the uncanny from a whole new perspective. The point is though, cinema, particularly horror cinema, has often used the concept of the doppelganger ever since the early days of the silver screen, but its origins are far, far older than that. Also, we should probably preface this video with the fact that the fear of the uncanny is one of my deepest, darkest fears. I'm not scared of much, but I am absolutely terrified of things that resemble the human form or people that I know that then turn out aren't those people at all. That goes for mannequins, cyborgs, and yes, clones. And also, sorry to anyone that is an identical twin, but you give me the heebie-jeebies. So yeah, let it be known that I'm facing my own fears. First and most importantly, we should probably approach this lore explored as we do with all others. After all, what's in a word? And if you're a fan of the King Killer Chronicles, then you'll certainly know that knowing the true name of something or someone is power enough, particularly if you know the name of the wind, but that's a story for another time. You see, the etymology of the doppelganger is as straightforward as you may imagine. The German language is remarkably efficient, and so it is a compound noun formed by the two German words doppel, meaning double, and ganger, meaning walker or goer. Literally, doppelganger means double goer, the non-biological spitting image of someone or something. Now, whilst the phrase was first coined in the German language in a novel written in 1796, which we'll get to later, the origins of it are older still. It is a function of folklore that has been disseminated since ancient civilization, which perhaps harkens back to the fact that the fear of the South is indeed hardwired into the human mind. Now, hold that point, because to understand the doppelganger we have to go back as far as possible, and interestingly enough we have to poke our head into the mythology of ancient Egypt. You see, in Egyptian mythology, and perhaps the first example of the uncanny, their ancient belief system portrayed the human soul as being split into several different components. One of those was Ka, which formed as a tangible spirit double which would manifest on the mortal plane and possess the same memories and feelings of their original counterpart. In the Greek princess, an ancient Egyptian myth that took place during the age of Pharaoh Seti II and presented a view of the legendary Trojan War, Helen of Troy found her own Ka manifesting without her knowledge, misleading Paris and subsequently ending the war. Now, useful, certainly, but it painted a picture of a human soul acting independently in the best interest of the whole. Interestingly enough though, that same function occurred again in an equally ancient belief system. In Norse mythology, a Vardoga, which loosely translates to soul watchman, was a ghostly double who would be seen as a sort of guardian spirit carrying out the actions of an individual before they had happened. Again, this would later occur in Finnish mythology, forming the basis of a figure known as an Etienen, a first-comer, an integral part of Finnish folklore that would later become a sort of premonition, a clairvoyant feeling of someone that was no longer present. And here is where folklore does what it does best and begin to take a primordial feeling or a concept and then layer it throughout many different cultures. You see, that same feeling and cluster of emotion evidently hung on a chord in ancient society. After all, in such a tumultuous time, it was only fitting that the widow of a warrior or the son of a bloodthirsty king would see ghosts of the past out of the corner of their eye. Although they perhaps didn't know it at the time, it is a psychological experience that has long lingered in the human mind. You see, the origins of the doppelganger are inexplicably tied to that of the dead. Later in Breton mythology, which includes Cornish, Welsh and Norman folklore, the Ankou is a familiar figure of this same paranormal feeling, a personification of death that would often take the form of the last person to die in a parish every year and then assume the duty of calling for the dead, a familiar face collecting the souls of the deceased. In the 19th century folklore compendium The Legend of Death, written by renowned Breton poet Antoine Lebras, he described the Ankou as the henchman of death, Obero Amaro, and he is also known as the Graveyard Watcher. They said that he protects the graveyard and the souls around it for some unknown reason, and he collects the lost souls of his land. The last dead of the year in each parish becomes the Ankou of his parish for all of the following year. When there has been in a year more deaths than usual, one says about the Ankou, "On my faith, this one is a nasty one." You see, if this feels familiar, That's because it is. The Onku is formed on the basis of many other Celtic figures of folklore, the Banshee, the Wraith, in many other senses, the ghosts of tradition. In Irish folklore, it is the Fetch, a doppelganger often regarded as an omen depicting an impending death. It is one that is also often related to the Morrigan, the great phantom queen, Mór Roigan, that would occur as a shade of a warrior just before their death, leading them by the hand to the other side. And you see, this is perhaps the reason why the doppelganger has so often been tied to the fear of death. In folklore throughout Europe and the wider world, seeing a shade of yourself or a version of yourself that should not exist heralded your untimely demise. If you caught a glimpse of yourself or your loved one where they shouldn't be, it often meant that the spirit already had one foot in the threshold. In 1617, the English metaphysical poet John Donne claimed that on one fateful night whilst travelling throughout France, he caught a glimpse of his wife's doppelganger, where he claimed it to be a wraith roaming through the streets of Paris. Unbeknownst to him, that same night would be the stillbirth of their daughter, and 5 days later, his wife Anne tragically died from the same postnatal complications. And here is where we can bring it back full circle to the first written occurrence of the word doppelganger, although by now we should certainly take note that the term itself takes many different forms. After all, not everything is as it may seem. In the romantic novel Siebenkäs, written by German writer Jean-Paul in 1796, the unhappily married titular character, Siebenkäs, consults his friend Liebgeber about what to do to end his unhappiness. Unbeknownst to him, but aware to the audience, Liebgeber is the alter ego or doppelganger of Siebenkäs, and he advises him to fake his own death to get out of it. Now, while Siebenkäs is a relatively comedic tale, the uncanny was still tied to the act of death or dying, cemented in the folklore of Europe, and so used as a literary device. But it was in the later, more gothic period of literature where the true horror of the other took another turn. In the 1824-part drama Prometheus Unbound, Percy Shelley speaks of the character of Zoroaster walking through a vast and abundant garden and meeting with his own image. Although only brief, it laid the seed, and this narrative device was used far more abundantly by Shelley's lifelong friend, the notorious Lord Byron, who employed the figure of the doppelganger as a metaphor for the duality of human nature. Again, although Byron skirted around the truth of the form, it was an example of a far more ancient feeling. Fear of the self, an extension of the human mind coalescing on the mortal plane, the consequence of one's actions, the metaphysical manifestation of fear and desire. In 1815, in The Devil's Elixir, a novel written by E.T.A. Hoffmann and based on the gothic classic The Monk, a man murders the brother and stepmother of the beloved princess Auriel on her request, who then finds that his doppelganger has instead been sentenced to death for these crimes. After battling with his own inner demons, he goes to great lengths to free his own doppelganger, who then goes on a rampage and kills the princess. Consequence: in action. Later in the 1825 work Tales by the O'Hara Family, written by brothers Michael and John Bainham, they talk of the fetches, the familiar image of villagers that occur throughout the twisting tales of proto-Gothic horror, this time taking a function of folklore and describing it on a larger scale. More importantly though, several decades later in 1846, the legendary Russian writer Fyodor Dostoevsky would pen one of his most remarkable novellas, The Double. It centers on a government clerk who goes mad, and the text itself then deals with the internal psychological struggle of its character, a theme which would lay the foundation of Dostoevsky's work and would later occur in many of his more complicated characters, notably the brothers Karamazov and Notes from the Underground. Dostoevsky dealt with the Gothic motif of the doppelganger by describing it as a character at odds with itself, the inner conflict of the human mind, one that could only be resolved by either side winning out. Which one would win would often be the vessel in which this horror was delivered, because, spoilers, but The Double has a far from happy ending. The point is, the 19th century was a period in the history of horror literature where the doppelganger truly found its stride by taking components of these tales of folklore and applying them to a far more psychological image, the uncanny, the mimic, the character who is far too familiar to be coincidental. In the 1913 German expressionism film The Student of Prague, this horror concept finds itself literally in combat with its own doppelganger, a visual demonstration of exactly what these 19th century writers were trying to portray. Later in 1970, in the Basil Dearden film The Man Who Haunted Himself, Roger Moore played a character whose doppelganger sprang into existence following his brief death on a operating table, who would then descend into madness trying to figure out if this doppelganger was indeed real or just a figment of his own imagination. And then, of course, in 2019, we come full circle, and we have Jordan Peele's Us, The Tethered, a mirror image of a family haunting the same family, the Tylers, each of them with a doppelganger of their own. Now, I certainly don't want to spoil any of the content of this movie, because if you haven't seen it, then you certainly should, but what Jordan Peele does in this film, like his predecessors before him, is take the ancient image of the doppelganger and give it a far more insightful meaning. You see, in 2019, in this strange new modern society and rapidly spiraling out of control technology, we are finding it increasingly difficult to look in the mirror and stare ourselves down. It seems that the truth behind our own doppelganger may be our most important fear to face. Werewolves! Ow! Oh, sorry, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, aren't I? Well, thankfully for us, there is a lot to sink our teeth into here, excuse the pun. Given the wanton folklore machinations of lycanthropes and the wolfmen of the wild that have long darted through the thicket in this wonderful tapestry of mythology and history. Believe it or not, but whilst werewolves are often underpinned as a hallmark of medieval Europe and the fears that descended during the Dark Ages, lycanthropes of ancient history date back to the dawn of human civilization. So, what is the truth behind it? Why are we humans so fascinated with the mysterious figure who succumbs entirely to the wild, giving themselves to the primal urges of the wolf? Let's find out. Hello horror fans, what's going on? And once again, welcome back to the Scary Channel on YouTube, top 5 scary videos. As per usual, I'll be your horror host, Jack Fincher. Today, in this latest episode of The Lore Explored, we rear our bloodthirsty moors skyward and take a look at the werewolf. Roll the clip. For the curious amongst you, that clip was from 2010's The Wolfman, starring Benicio del Toro as one particular wolfman with a few daddy issues, illustrating the archetypal mysticism and many taboos that evidently come with being a lycanthrope, particularly if you're a 19th century aristocrat in Victorian London. And as some of you may know, The Wolfman is a near-direct remake of 1941's The Wolf Man, starring Lon Chaney Jr. as the titular beast man in question, which is widely considered to be the most recognizable and most cherished original version of the werewolf myth ever created on film. And whilst it certainly wasn't the first, it's one of the best, and it gave popular rise to what we now consider to be werewolf horror cinema, cementing other actors such as the legendary Paul Naschy, Henry Hull, Oliver Reed, Jack Nicholson and David Norton in their iconic lycanthropic roles. But first, before we give credit to the hallmarks of horror cinema that the image of the werewolf has become, let's first begin where all things should. Etymology. After all, what's in a word? As you may imagine, the word werewolf comes from the Old English compound of were, meaning man, and wolf, meaning, well, wolf. Now, although this is certainly the clearest definitive origin of the term, there are other far older origins of similar sorts of terms. Low Latin describes the gerulphus, which the French later misheard as garrevue, which means beware, harking back to their description of the iconic loup-garou, a wolf to be aware of. But it's older than that still, and although the Norman Frankish described the werewolf, Old Norse describes the varulfa, or in much rarer terms the ulfhedin, one in wolfskin. In modern Scandinavian there is even the kveldulf, the evening wolf, considered to be derived from the name of the legendary Kvedulf Bjalfason, a historical Norse berserker from the 9th century. However, the actual term lycanthropy comes from an ancient Greek term as a compound of leukos, meaning wolf, and anthropos, meaning human. Although the term doesn't appear until late antiquity, it is derived from a far more ancient one, therianthropy, the mythological act of metamorphosis and shapeshifting from a human to an animal that is as old as ancient Egyptian mythology, appearing in the mythos of myriad African and Eurasian cultures and folklore, from ancient Mesoamerica to the Kingdom of China. As it seems, the act of transforming from a human being to a primal creature has played an integral part in the methods of our ancient oral and recorded traditions. And here is where things get interesting, because although the origins of the term werewolf are ancient indeed, the archetypal European concept of the werewolf emerges from a very clear source, that being the ferociously feared warrior classes of the ancient Germanic tribes, many of whom revered the wolf as a potent symbol of both hunter and fighter. You see, the transformation from men into wolves was a wide held belief throughout Iron Age Europe, particularly in the Germanic sphere, often highlighted in their belief of Tierkrieger, also known as Woden or Odin in Norse, the leader of the wild hunt himself. Interestingly enough, it has also been noted that the metaphorical image of the widespread belief of wolf men in ancient Europe and the wider Indo-European sphere is directly correlated to the tribal transition of Europeans moving from fruit gathering to predatory hunting during the Iron Age, a forgotten cultural practice that was revered by ancient pagan European society. In 440 BC, the ancient Greek historian Herodotus, in his histories, described the Nuri, a tribe which he placed in the northeast of Scythia, where all of its members transformed into wolves once every year for several days, where they roamed the wilds before changing back to their human forms. Now, in all likelihood, this was a tribe that is now part of Russia, and the tribespeople of the Nuri were most certainly using wolf skins and pelts for warmth during winter, but still, the metaphor is what's important here. Similarly, in the 2nd century BC, the Greek geographer Pausanias described the story of Lycaon, the king of Arcadia, who was transformed into a wolf following his ritualistic murder of a child. Lycaon's transformation was bestowed upon by Zeus after his attempt to serve him human flesh to discover if he truly was a god, depicting cannibalism and murder as a grave taboo, and the result being this primal, torturous prison. As written by Ovid in his Metamorphosis, describing the transformation of King Lycaon, he tried to speak, but his voice broke into an echoing howl. His ravening soul infected his jaws, his murderous longings were turned on the cattle, he still was possessed by bloodlust. His garments were changed to a shaggy coat, and his arms into legs. He was now transformed into a wolf. However, although numerous are these references to man transforming to wolf in ancient literature, it is older than even that. You see, the first ever allusion to a man transforming into a wolf astoundingly dates back to the oldest surviving great work of literature in human history, the Epic of Gilgamesh, dating back to the 3rd dynasty of Ur, roughly around 2100 BC. Lycanthropy, as it seems, is a tale as old as time. But why? What is it of these monsters to men? What is this morbid fascination that many of our cultures have held with the act of this primalistic transformation? Inexplicably, as ancient history is often suggested, it occurred with the debasement of the human moral spirit, succumbing to the bloodthirsty primal urges of a violent act, murder, cannibalism, the sight of a frightful massacre, not in any sense of the martial or the art of war, because as we know the ancient world certainly enjoyed a battle or two, but in the actions outside of what was considered moralistically sound of the time. And perhaps here is where the werewolf tale begins to take on its far more human sensibility. You see, the werewolf is a bizarre construct. It comes from a cultural function of damning, violent and bloodthirsty actions, but as Europe wrestled itself from the grip of the Roman Empire, the cultural myth of the werewolf seemed to expand into the role of almost a guardian of sorts, albeit one that was primed for feasting on human flesh. You see, the Germanic pagan traditions that we previously spoke of persisted longest throughout the Scandinavian Viking Age. King Harald Fairhair of Norway was said to have commanded his troop of Ulfhednar, often mentioned throughout the Volsunga saga, fearsome berserkers who wore the skins of wolves to channel the spirits of these ferocious animals to enhance their effectiveness in battle. This was continued in the traditional period of the Kievan Rus, a loose confederation of Slavic and Finnic peoples of Europe throughout the 9th to the mid 13th century, which would form the legendary Slavic mythology of the werewolf, one that is far different from the medieval depiction of the Lycan. Historically speaking, the legendary 11th century Belarusian prince Vleslav of Polotsk was very openly considered to have been a werewolf, reportedly capable of moving at superhuman speeds and proudly documented in the 12th century text, The Tale of Igor's Campaign. Here it was stated that Vleslav the prince judged men. As prince he ruled towns, but at night he prowled in the guise of a wolf. From Kiev prowling he reached before the cock's crew, Tumtakaran, the path of great sun. As a wolf prowling he crossed. For him in Polotsk they rang for matins early, at St. Sophia the bells, but he heard the ringing in Kiev. And so this is where we come to our most accurate understanding of the werewolf in modern horror fiction, one that was proliferated in the many tales that occurred throughout the dawn of medieval Europe. Burchard of Worms of the Holy Roman Empire spoke of werewolves that roamed the countryside murdering folk in their sleep. Later, Liutprand of Cremona allegedly spread a rumour that Prince Bahan, the only son of King Simeon of Bulgaria, could use his debased magic to transform into a wolf at will. On the other hand, in Marie de France's poem Bisclaveret, written in the year 1200, she describes a nobleman, Bizunet, millionaire who was cursed to transform into a wolf once every week. However, when his treacherous wife had stolen his clothing needed to restore his human form, he escaped the king's wolf hunt by imploring the king for mercy, and then as an act of penance accompanied the king as his own werewolf bodyguard. That's pretty damn interesting, right? Perhaps the Slavic traditions were rubbing off on them. You see, this is the beginning of the very clear duality now found of the werewolf in horror literature. On one hand, the Slavic reverence held for the Lycan as depicted through the ancient pagan traditions of Iron Age Europe, one that is not a werewolf in the same sense but a vlodglak, a wolfskin, which would later become associated with the concept of the revenant, the vampire, which is a hero to some and evil to others. But then on the other hand, we have the Germanic werewolf, or more importantly, the medieval werewolf, widely associated with the witchcraft panic beginning roughly around 1400 AD, a period of folklore history that hit its fever pitch in 16th century France and Germany. You see, here there were countless reports of werewolf attacks, hundreds of them in fact, court trials clearly recorded in history, and in some fewer cases clearly found evidence against the accused Lycan of both murder and cannibalism, which interestingly enough harkens back to the same fear that we found in the ancient Greek depictions of lycanthropy. Hey, I'm not saying that there's a direct correlation between the Holy Roman Empire and the medieval werewolf, but it's certainly interesting, and also it is. Accusations of lycanthropy were frequent in the Valais witch trials of 1428. In the canton of Vaud, which borders the cantons of Fribourg and Bern, numerous child-eating werewolves were reported through the year 1448. In 1598 in Anjou, a gang of werewolves was sighted roaming the rivers of the French lowlands, and in 1603 in Bordeaux, a teenage werewolf was sentenced to life imprisonment for the crimes of lycanthropy. Perhaps the most famous case of the medieval werewolf, though, came to the forefront with the bloodthirsty tale of Peter Stump, a German farmer and alleged cannibalistic serial killer reported to have murdered and eaten over 18 victims, including 14 children and 2 pregnant women, after the devil himself had allegedly given him a werewolf girdle of black magic which bestowed upon him the all-consuming power and hunger of a wolf. Peter Stump, otherwise known as the werewolf of Bedburg, is perhaps the root form of what we now consider to be the classic werewolf of horror literature and cinema, but interestingly enough, it is one that focuses exclusively on the violent and bloodthirsty nature of a man who is caught physically or metaphorically transforming into a beast. Interestingly enough though, more often than not, the modern werewolf has often become a sort of hybrid of these two dualistic components of the ancient Lycan, the conventions of which are just as much of a hodgepodge as its forebears were. Take for example the folklore depiction of silver being a repellent to a werewolf. You see, silver in folklore, particularly in Celtic folklore, is a very important trope, but as to where it came about in relation to lycanthropy is anyone's guess. In 1640, as folklore tradition describes, the city of Greifswald in Germany was infested by a pack of werewolves, and as was written, a clever lad suggested that they gather all their silver buttons, goblets, belt buckles and so forth, and then melt them down into bullets for their muskets and pistols. This time it worked, and they slaughtered the creatures and rid Greifswald of the lycanthropes. You see, in many ways the fiction of the werewolf is a constant work in progress, constantly grabbing different components of folklore, superstition, mysticism and religion and piling it atop the wolfskin legend. In that regard, the werewolf is perhaps the most forward-thinking horror convention ever known. In The White Wolf of the Harz Mountains, a short story appearing in the Phantom Ship written in 1839 by Frederick Marryat, the first ever demonic femme fatale was penned, one that this time transformed itself from woman into wolf. This trope would occur sparingly throughout Gothic literature, but after the 1970s, particularly following Angela Carter's The Bloody Chamber and her short story The Company of Wolves written in 1979, the female lycanthrope changed the game once more, culminating in Ginger Snaps, released in the year 2000, which is freaking awesome, and then again with 2011's Red Riding Hood, which isn't great, but it highlights my point, taking these themes and then applying the transformation of lycanthropy to that of sexuality and a transgressive discovery of the self, highlighting the liberation that comes from championing the natural form. And again here, the concept of the werewolf in culture has often been used to highlight a sort of social movement of sorts, be it one that is taboo like the werewolf of medieval Europe, describing the fears of serial killers and cannibalistic monsters, or the satanic panic of witchcraft by the Holy Roman Empire, or on the other hand, one of a cultural advocacy and guardianship like that of the Slavic werewolf, who harnessed the more primal urges of the human form to their advantage, often as a force for good in defense of their own tribe or people. You see, be it monster or man, so it seems that the duality of the werewolf has long lingered in the hearts of humanity for thousands of years, and will perhaps linger for thousands of years more. After all, aren't we just wild animals howling at the moon? Secure, contain, protect, or special containment procedures? You see, it depends which way you look at it really, or more importantly, which direction your headcanon is pointed, so you can then somehow manage to comprehend the mind-boggling anomalies of the SCP Foundation. And you might be thinking, what the hell are you talking about, Jack? What the hell is a headcanon? And why would anyone ever want to wear such a strange mixture of headwear and artillery? Well, as many of you may already know, and the rest of you will soon find out, there's a lot to wrap your head around when it comes to the inner workings of the SCP Foundation. So for our next stop on the lore explored, let's see if we can shed some light on the matter. Yeah, we're probably going to need backup. Hello horror fans, what's going on? And once again, welcome back to the Scariest channel on YouTube, Top 5 Scary Videos. As per usual, I'll be your horror host, Jack Finch, as today, for our second part of this series, we explore the lore behind the SCP Foundation. Roll the clip. For the curious amongst you, that clip was from a fan-made short movie doofily named SCP Dollhouse, written and created by Evan Royalty, which you should certainly check out because for an independent piece of cinema, it's incredibly well made, but most importantly, it shows an understanding of the subject matter made by a fan for fans of the SCP Foundation. As you will soon realise, that is an incredibly important modicum as we step into this world. We'll leave a link down below so that you can wrap your ocular lenses around it for yourself, and that also leads us to our first and most important point. What the hell is all of this about? Anyway, you keep saying words, Jack, but all I'm hearing is SCP. Now, whilst I understand that we'll be delving deep into this particular organisation, I also understand that we'll have to bring everyone else up to speed. So for those of you that don't know, let's have a quick history lesson. Way back when, in 2007, during the simpler days of the internet, when Newgrounds was still in full swing and World of Warcraft wasn't quite a pandemic just yet, something was happening over on the Paranormal X boards of 4chan. It was a place known for its relatively imaginative taste in horror, more science fiction than the supernatural, a place where sci-fi was obtusely blended with more off-the-wall interpretations of horror, shall we say, and a place where creepypastas were quickly becoming a dime a dozen. Tree Dog, Ted the Caver, Polybius. You see, the more gloomy corners of the internet had been saturated for quite some time with the same old tried and tested formulas of long-form chainmail horror. People wanted something new, and whether a particular episode of David Tennant's Doctor Who had something to do with that, we may never know. But then this arrived, a post simply titled SCP-173, seemingly a meta-document of an organisation whose sole purpose was to contain this strange entity titled 173, a creature made from concrete and rebar. It appeared to be some sort of statue of unknown origin that, unless eye contact was maintained with it at all times, would just snap your neck. The document was short enough to pique many people's interest, but also just long enough to allow for the gears of imagination to begin turning. What was this place? Who was behind this organisation that seemingly had at least 172 other creatures like this under their containment? Well, as far as these special containment procedures were concerned, this was of course the beginning of the largest collaborative writing project ever. And really, there has been nothing like this so far in our cultural history, which in many ways is exactly why it's so difficult to fully comprehend. There are so many moving parts to this hulking behemoth of literature, all being worked on independently and then collaboratively in huge swathes of upvotes and downvotes where the community decides what is good and what is bad. It is a self-regulating system where taste for literature is decided by the masses. In many ways, this is as if a hive mind had been tasked with writing the most complete anomalous novel known to mankind. And that's exactly what we've got. The SCP Foundation, now in its most complete form, is an archived wiki that has compiled over 4,999 of these entries, and although in a relatively long hiatus, it is still being worked on. Now, whilst there are nearly 5,000 of these separate entities, items and phenomena clearly detailed and documented, there are also tens of thousands of supporting documents, each of them slightly augmenting any given SCP entry. And if this sounds like the kind of casework that would rival even the FBI, that's because that was exactly the intention. How do you create an organisation whose sole purpose it is to scour our planet hell, even other dimensions, to round up all of the things that go bump in the night while still managing to diligently do the paperwork? you do exactly that. You don't just create it, you live it. You do the paperwork. You compile hundreds of thousands of separate documents to comprise your existence out of thin air. And that is exactly the framing device for we as an audience to then attempt to understand it. Imagine if you took an alien who had no concept of our planet, our laws, our shared culture, anything, and then you sat them down and tried to explain what the FBI was. Yeah, well, instead of that, imagine saying nothing to them, throwing them into a dark room and just giving them a box of documents, archived records for them to work their way through gradually. This is where we're at. And now that we've covered the initial framing device, we can now talk about the lore behind the organization itself, and more importantly, the people behind it, the characters, because you may be asking yourself, alright, I'm hooked, but who the hell would or even could run this kind of show? Who's in charge here? Who's calling the shots when it means keeping 5,000 cosmic horrors under lock and key? Well, this is where things get interesting, and we can talk about hierarchy, if you could even call it that. For the sake of parity though, let's start at the bottom. As Orwell famously said, the power lies in the proletariat, but in this case, the proletariat are instead vile murderous criminals on death row who are either given the chance to work for the SCP Foundation or, well, die. It's like that Eddie Izzard sketch, Cake or Death, except in this case the cake is a lie, and how is that for a three-way crossover of a reference for you? The SCP Foundation, Eddie Izzard and Portal. This is metafiction for a reason though, am I right? Anyway, the point is, in the SCP Foundation, the D-class personnel do all of the heavy lifting. Why? Because, well, two reasons. One, in the eyes of the Foundation, they're entirely disposable, and being the janitor in a massive, complex web of underground facilities is quite the occupational hazard. And two, part of the Foundation's directive isn't just to keep these anomalous entities under constant lock and key, but to understand them too. And for every experiment, you need lab mice. Yeah, you can see where I'm going with this, right? The thing is though, take everything that I've just said with a pinch of salt. Because do you know that headcanon I was talking about earlier? Well, the entire point of the SCP Foundation is that there are paradoxes upon contradictions, and yet the nature of this sprawling mass of fiction is with how you interpret it. All D-class personnel might not be death row inmates. In some cases, they might be kidnapped individuals or political prisoners, and the Foundation are running a terrifying human trafficking racket. Or, as is the case with SCP-2000, they may just be a series of cloned humans from an off-site facility being put to use in a more mundane yet equally brutal manner. Either way, these guys do the heavy lifting, and if there's an endless darkened stairway to plummet, as is the case with SCP-087, the Foundation are more than willing to send a few D-class downstairs to see just what all the fuss is about. Above them, in a more mundane and also kind of grey area, are the Foundation's research staff. And yes, there are characters in the Foundation who work 9 to 5, Monday to Friday, checking boxes and conducting experiments. But that's not all there is to it. Now, this one is really going to be difficult to touch on because, well, put it this way, if we jump out of canon for a moment, the core group of people who started the SCP Foundation Wiki back in 2007 and 2008, well, whilst they are researchers in both the literal and meta sense, they also have in-world characters that kind of fit into the same role, but also completely blow the doors off it. You see, whilst they were administrators in the literal sense, running the SCP Wiki from a technical perspective, in the canon of the Foundation, they also had their fictional counterparts, doctors, research staff, Dr. Bright, Dr. Mann, Dr. Clef, Dr. Kondraki, and many, many more, all written and woven into the many SCP entries and their supporting documents. Although they kind of are, to call them just research staff would be completely sidestepping their function entirely, and because of that, we'll probably just jump up to the next rung on the ladder. Because although these are very valid indicators as to who calls the shots in this strange fictional world, the real big players, of course, are a group of individuals at the top of the pile referred to as the O5 Council. And no, there are not 5 of them, there are in fact 13. And yet the 5 in their name refers to their level of security clearance. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There is none higher, and if you read a particular entry titled O5 Command Only, then, well, you know it's going to be a good one. 13 individuals, all of them arbiters of such grand secrets and anomalous mysteries that it's any wonder that these guys ever get the time to make any form of clerical decision. You see, in the classic manner, even their identity is ambiguous. The vast majority of the 13 council members are merely guesses, and many of the Foundation's records are speculative dossiers as to their true identity. Take 051, for example, often reported to be the most powerful council member, the first one, even if there is such a thing. There are several possibilities as to their identity. The first, a document dubbed The Founder, described a European man, seemingly of over 150 years of age, who is alleged to be the founding administrator of the Foundation after the witness of SCP-001 The Factory. But hey, that's a story for a different video. Told you it was complicated. Contrary to that, 051 could also be a woman named Eve, an individual of ancient Sumerian origin who claims to be Adam's third wife and is anywhere between 10,000 and 15,000 years old. And yeah, that's a head scratcher. You see, the truth of the matter is we can only partially cover the massive mechanics that surround these individuals, and yeah, more than likely we're going to have to do more than just one part of this Lore Explored series, because solely focusing on who the hell the O5 Council could possibly be, if that's even possible to discern, because I'm not entirely sure if it is. You see, the point is, when we talk about head canon, this is exactly what we mean. If this entire video seems loose and ambiguous and not entirely sensical, that's because that is the Foundation's intention. Its very nature lures the curious mind to keep digging, scouring through records, finding small compendiums of information and compiling them into larger, more fully formed areas of imagination. The SCP Foundation challenges us to just keep digging and to make our own connections between the true extent of this piece of literature, because that's exactly what it is. The SCP Foundation is a novel spanning thousands upon thousands of pages, a word count that would make a million Shakespeare's pale in anomalous embarrassment. It is a work of art contributed to continuously by countless individuals. It is the democratization of literature, and we're witnessing it right now, ever since the small snippet of a post emerged on 4chan back in 2007. And that is a pretty exciting thing. As John Milton, the 17th century wordsmith and dreamer, so painstakingly penned in his crowning glory of an epic poem, Paradise Lost, better to reign in hell than to serve in heaven. Blasphemy, surely, for a piece of literature originally published back in 1667, which fictionalized the fall of the angel Satan down into the pit of Tartarus after being defeated and banished by the forces of heaven. Even in terms of fiction as an allegorical vessel for the inner turmoil of the human soul, historically speaking, John Milton risked life and limb to fantasize such a story. Although Dante did the same several centuries earlier in the Divine Comedy, the fictional forces of both heaven and hell had never been before so polarized in a work of literature as they were in Paradise Lost. Wow, since then, things have changed quite a bit, so let's take a look at one of the more iconic depictions of angels and demons in modern fiction, Diablo. Hello horror fans, what's going on? And once again, welcome back to the Scariest channel on YouTube, Top 5 Scary Videos. As per usual, I'll be your horror host, Jack Finch. Today, in this latest episode of the Lore Explored, we take a look at the fiction behind the Diablo franchise. Roll the clip.
The armies of light and shadow will clash across the fields of eternity.
Stay a while and listen. You see, for the curious amongst you, of course, we couldn't kickstart this particular episode without giving some form of cameo credit to the lorekeeper himself, the late great legend of all things Immaterium, Deckard Cain. For the even curiouser amongst you though, of course we should also paint the picture of just exactly what we're talking about here. And for those of you that don't know, the Diablo franchise is a series of video games first published by Blizzard Entertainment back in 1996. Later in the year 2000, it was followed by Diablo 2 and then Diablo 2 Lord of Destruction, the greatest of the franchise in my opinion, and finally 2008's Diablo 3, which was pretty good but no nip on nostalgia. You see, the hype surrounding this and the most important reason for us to bring the awesome Diablo lore to the forefront is because recently the fourth entry in the franchise has been revealed. Personally, I'm not impressed by what I've seen so far of Diablo 4, but whatever you think about Blizzard as a once mighty franchise, there is no denying the fact that where their expertise truly shines is in telling a damn good story, and the remarkable lore behind Diablo is no exception. Really, perhaps more so than any other games publisher, Blizzard are masters of their craft, and the lore behind Diablo is some of the finest in dark fantasy fiction. And of course, what better place to begin a tale of good and evil than with the purest essence of the two. In the beginning there was nothing save for a single pearl, and in that pearl there slept a dreaming, mighty, unfathomable spirit, Anu, the One. The very first being of creation, Anu was the sum of all things, both good and evil, light and dark, the physical and the mystical, joy and sadness, all of them personified in the crystallization of this perfect being. You see, Anu, in its state of total purity and perfection, over boundless eons cast all evil from itself, and for a perfect moment in time and space, all manners of dissonance and evil was gone. But just as matter cannot be created nor destroyed, neither can the energy of evil. In the void of existence, soon enough, the discordant fragments that Anu had cast out formed themselves into another being, Tathamet, the first of the prime evils. Now, although they were separated, they were bound within the same pearl of existence, and so they waged a war of light and shadow against each other for countless millennia, neither of them ever gaining the upper hand. This is known as the Great Conflict, the underlying and most important dichotomy in the whole of the Diablo franchise. You see, the energies that were unleashed in the impossible war ignited an explosion of light and matter so vast and terrible that it birthed the very universe itself. And here we have the very first of the many planes of existence that make up the Diablo franchise, in a realm known as Pandemonium, forged by the resulting cataclysm of Anu and Tathamet as they delivered their final blows to each other, laying the foundation for all of creation. In the aftermath, the great bodies of these entities made up the physicality of the plane of Pandemonium. Anu's shining spine formed the crystal arch, and the high heavens formed around it. On the other hand, excuse the pun, Tathamet's broken corpse formed the basis of the burning hells, and as these seeds were both sown, these two realms of Pandemonium eventually gave birth to angels and demons respectively. There was one relic left behind though that would become integral to this great conflict, Anu's eye, a remainder from the broken bones of his corpse that would later become what is known as the World Stone, an artifact of such incredible power that it could give birth to entire worlds of creation. And so as imperfect beings, both angels and demons sought the World Stone to become the de facto force of Pandemonium, and another great war waged for millennia. In the process, the Pandemonium fortress was built to house the World Stone, but the artifact changed hands many times, eventually leading to one of the most important moments in the lore of the Diablo series, and one which features a little known character that will heavily influence the direction of the newest Diablo 4 installment. Lilith, a name which many of you may be familiar with. You see, after eons of battle and needless bloodshed, one angel, Inarius, he grew tired of this eternal conflict. Inarius was an archangel of the high heavens, heavily respected and part of the Enigris Council, the right hand of heaven. He was also the brother of Tyrael, perhaps one of the most iconic characters in the series, and even attempted to persuade him to put down his own sword and leave the great conflict behind. None of the archangels would listen to him though, Tyrael included, and so instead Inarius turned to those amongst the demons who also felt the same way. Lilith, queen of the succubi and daughter of Mephisto, also grew tired of the endless conflict, and together Inarius and Lilith led these angel and demon rebels through one of the most important periods of Diablo lore. Together in an act of unprecedented rebellion, the angel Inarius and the demon Lilith stole the World Stone, fled from Pandemonium, and in the process they created Sanctuary, the world in which the vast bulk of Diablo is set, a place far away from the warring ways of heaven and hell and the eternal conflict of good and evil. In this brave new world, Inarius and Lilith would later fall in love with each other, as did many of the other rebel angels and demons, and from these angelic and demonic unions, the Nephilim were born, the first generation of human beings. And for those of you that have played Diablo 3, you'll know that the Nephilim are pretty integral toward the player character throughout the series, but hey, forget about that. let's not ruin the immersion, right? You see, this didn't last long, and it seemed that the tremors of the same conflict that both Inarius and Lilith had fled from had managed to seep into Sanctuary too. Their children, the Nephilim, possessed incredible innate powers, perhaps enough to one day rival and surpass that of both angels and demons. On one hand, Lilith saw their incredible potential, and she realized that given enough attention, the Nephilim could grow to such a point that one day they could overthrow both heaven and hell, and together they could bring an end to the great conflict and the endless eternal struggle. On the other, Inarius feared them greatly, and he wanted to kill them all. As a result, eventually, after Lilith had slaughtered all of Inarius' angelic allies, he used the power of the World Stone to cast her for eternity into the void, where he intended for her to stay imprisoned for all of time. If you know anything about the Diablo series though, it's pretty difficult to keep a good demon down. Now what follows is a period in the Diablo lore known as the Sin War, and it is an incredibly complex conflict that we couldn't do justice to unless it had a video of its own. It takes place in the trilogy of novels by Richard A. Knack, released from 2006 onwards, featuring Birthright, Scales of the Serpent, and finally The Veiled Prophet. They're remarkably well written, and if you're feeling some Diablo lore, they come highly recommended actually. As you may imagine, covering an entire trilogy of novels takes a moment or two to do, but for the sake of framing this section of the lore explored correctly, excuse the spark notes. Essentially, throughout the Sin War, Lilith managed to return to Sanctuary from her prison, where she then raised the Nephilim into her own personal army in an attempt to defeat Inarius once and for all. Ultimately, she fails, where Inarius casts her once again into the void, but if the cinematic trailer of Diablo 4 is anything to go by, yeah, she's making a bit of a comeback. Inarius, on the other hand, although victorious, was in for a far worse fate. At the climax of the Sin War, Inarius was eventually driven to madness as he waged a war against Lilith's Nephilim army, championed by a figure known as Odyssean, and in the process most of Sanctuary was turned asunder. As they battle with each other, the angels of heaven eventually intervene, tearing open the sky and bringing an end to the conflict. As a result, Odyssean, he cast both angels and demons from Sanctuary once and for all, and the Anguirus Council of the Archangels began to broker the fate of both the Nephilim and the now fallen angel Inarius. Some of the Nephilim, like Rathma, son of Lilith and the first Necromancer, pleaded with heaven to spare Sanctuary, and as a result, a vote was held between the angels. Imperius, the Archangel of Valor and the de facto leader of them, voted against Sanctuary's existence. Auriel, Archangel of Hope, she voted for it. The deciding factor was laid before Tyrael, Inarius' own brother, who initially seemed to show little love for humanity and the Nephilim. Together, ultimately though, they agreed to an armistice between the high heavens and the burning hells. As Tyrael decided, inspired by Odyssean's sacrifice, Sanctuary should be free to live on its own, with no war brought there by either heaven or hell. From then on, humanity would be free to choose for themselves how to move forward as a people, free from the interference of both angels and demons, free to walk the path of both order and chaos. However, there was a caveat to Tyrael's proposal, and in turn for agreeing the terms of the armistice, Mephisto, one of the three prime evils, the demon lord of hatred and the father of Lilith himself, wanted vengeance for his daughter's imprisonment in the void. And so Inarius was given over to Mephisto's custody, and what followed was one of the most brutal punishments in the entire Diablo series. As the first Diablo video game explains, he bound Inarius with tremendous chains and slowly tore the wings from the back of the angel. Great barbed hooks were then used to stretch out the once glowing skin, and his features were distorted by vile powers. Many of the followers of Inarius were given as gifts to both Baal and Diablo, and the rest were molded to match the bloated image of the now crippled angel. To this day, Inarius is said to be trapped in hell within a chamber of mirrors, his eyelids torn from his face as he is forced to gaze upon his misshapen form for all of eternity. Yeah, exactly. Pretty freaking harsh punishment, right? But as you'll know, you probably shouldn't go messing about with the daughter of a prime evil, really. Nevertheless, whatever the repercussions, the stage was set for the emergence of the Diablo series. Sanctuary would become the blank slate in which this proxy war of both heaven and hell would be continuously fought. And despite an uneasy truce, it seemed that the embers of the great conflict were never fully stamped out. You see, as so far as demons are concerned, the pursuit of power could never truly be sated. The three prime evils of hell, Diablo, Mephisto, and Baal, were dethroned by their lesser denizens. During this moment of peace against the angels, the four lesser evils of hell, Azmodan, Belial, and Dariel and Juriel, saw their opportunity to usurp them, and in the process ultimately exiled the three prime evils into the world of Sanctuary. And of course, that is where our setting for the first Diablo game takes place. After the Haradrim, under the guidance of the Archangel Tyrael, establish a defense against the seeping evils of hell by binding them all to powerful magical artifacts, soul stones, Diablo, Lord of Terror, and Destroyer of Souls included. And what does it take to keep all of that at bay? How do you hold back the devious machinations of both angels and demons alike? What will it take to save Sanctuary from the scheming wills of an almighty power?